Hello and welcome to week 6 in Child Development 39. This week we will be looking at behaviorism theories. Behaviorism varies a little bit different from the previous couple of weeks that we've looked at because whereas in cognitive, for example, Piaget's theory is pretty much the overarching one that gives us much of what we know. In behaviorism, we have a variety of different contributors. And each of them sort of built off one another and studied different aspects or variations of behavior, and thus kind of together gave us the theories and information we have as it relates to behaviorism. So there will be a lot more theorists to look at this week. There's going to be 4 in particular that we will look at, although there are many more behaviorism theorists than just those 4. But Pavlov, Watson, Skinner, and Bandura are the primary contributors for behaviorism as far as what's important for the field of child development. So we will look at those, and an objective for this week will be to describe the main principles of those theories and theorists, explain the differences between the ideas of those theories. As I said, they're kind of related, but they kind of branched off and studied different aspects or different parts of those theories. And then apply the behavior theories to a scenario or case study. So at the end of the week, we'll work on that assignment. It'll be interesting for you to see sort of how that looks in action, and you'll have a choice of sort of which theory to use to compare. So those are our objectives for this week. Like I said, we'll go over those 4 theories. So behaviorism is sort of a study in itself. We had, sociocultural theory and psychosexual theory and cognitive theory. Behaviorism in itself is sort of a study or a field of theory and available research. So behaviorism is the study of behavior just as it sounds. It is a scientific study, so the scientific method is applied just as in the other theories and field of child development. The purpose of behaviorism is that they sought to determine prediction and ability to control. So basically, the underlying idea was, how do behaviors happen, and then how can we change them or control them or predict them in some cases, and then how and why that's beneficial to children, and then of course adults as well. Behaviorism theorists, as opposed or in contrast to cognitive, for example, rejected references to the mind or cognition and focused only on observable characteristics and patterns of behaviors. So whereas Piaget, for example, would have said, I'm really interested in why this child did this, I want to do some theory or additional research and find out why, behaviorists said, no, I don't care about the thought behind it or the process or what happened mentally. I just want to see the behavior itself, observe that, and figure out what's going on, what happened, what's the pattern, how can I change it, predict it, etc. So it's more of a narrow lens of study than some of the other theorists that we've looked at, and it's definitely very focused with specific intent as far as the research goes and what the desired results are in the end. So Ivan Pavlov is the first main theorist. I'm sure that most of you have heard of him. He's very famous for his study, Pavlov's law, or Pavlov's dogs, you may have heard. So he was actually a physiologist who was studying digestion. So he was a medical professional, not necessarily a researcher in itself, but he was doing research on laboratory dogs, and noted that they salivated before they had any food in front of them. So what happened, and what he started noticing, is the dogs would hear the footsteps of the individual in the hallway coming to bring their food, and although they couldn't see them and didn't in fact know for sure that food was coming, they began to salivate just at the thought or idea of food. And so Pavlov, through his work and study, developed the concept of conditioned reflex, meaning we automatically do things based on responses that have been conditioned in us. So reflexes, for example, are things like breathing. You don't think about it, you just do it automatically. Blinking, right? You don't ever have to think or tell yourself to blink, you just do. And so a conditioned reflex is that very same thing. It's a very specific behavior that's been conditioned over time and has now become a reflex, such as the salivating in the dogs, just based on past experiences. So there's kind of a lot of different aspects to conditioning. What is learned and conditioned, as I just mentioned, is a response that's been developed to something based on past experiences. And then classical conditioning is where most of Pavlov's work lied. And he basically wanted to condition a specific behavior response in the dogs, or tests that he would be able to. And so he started ringing a bell when the food was being brought, and then over time actually replaced the footsteps with the bell. And in fact, the dogs did begin to salivate from hearing the bell over time after enough experiences with that. So the behavior that was trained intentionally through conditioning with various stimuli is called the conditioned response. So in this case, salivation was the conditioned response to the stimulus of a bell versus footsteps. So either one in this case would have been the conditioned stimulus. So we created intentionally a certain behavioral response based on a stimulus. Um, and then John B. Watson sort of expanded on Pavlov's work and added kind of a lot of different pieces to it. And he looked at it specifically through the lens of our fears and emotional responses. So John B. Watson sort of had the idea that emotionally we are conditioned to feel a certain way or believe certain things or respond in certain ways to people or events or activities. And our actions, and especially specifically related to fears and emotions, are in response to things that have happened before. So he felt, in short, that our fears and emotional responses are situational and the result of classical conditioning. So he did an experiment with a little boy called Little Albert, and you'll see video of this in the module. He showed him a lot of different items and cards and toys and kind of just introduced him to a variety of things. And little Albert sort of was drawn to this white rat that was part of the study, and that was introduced over time. And so although he liked that white rat and responded positively to it and really enjoyed it, over time, John B. Watson exposed him to something scary when that rat was introduced, which in this case was a loud sound. If you're not aware, being afraid of loud sounds is a normal and classic response for young children. That's a normal fear for them. And so over time, he became fearful of the white rat simply because he associated it with that loud sound, which he was scared of. So he connected his research on conditioning to parenting and did a lot of material and publications related to parenting based on his research in an effort to convince people basically that behaviors could be trained and taught. So if you want your child's behavior to change one way or the other, you can train that and teach that by being intentional and by classically conditioning them. So very controversial experiment. I'm not sure how I feel about that mother. Maybe they paid her well. I don't know, but I think that would have been a little bit hard for me to sit through. So you'll see this and you can make your own assumptions or determinations about what you think about the experiment. But it did give some pretty interesting research regarding behavior. You know, it produced some interesting results, which of course now, you know, we can expand on and know more about. B.F. Skinner then did some research on operant conditioning. And so classical conditioning is when things are kind of just naturally ingrained and conditioned into us, as we mentioned before with the last two theorists, whereas operant conditioning is intentional conditioning. So in this case, basically some of the end results of his work is, number one, reinforcement is the most effective way of encouraging a behavior. So he felt like if you had the option to criticize or punish a child for something or praise and reinforce them, that a reinforcer is going to be much more highly effective at engaging and encouraging a positive behavior. Criticism and punishment for a wrong behavior are far less effective than praise and reinforcement for a right behavior. So a reinforcer is anything that encourages or promotes a behavior. I worked in a special education classroom for 4 years, and we had to use a lot of reinforcers because the children had, you know, a harder time meeting the expectations or maintaining positive behaviors depending on their disabilities. And so we used reinforcers like stickers for some children, and that worked really well. We used candy for other children if it was okay with the parents. Sometimes it was extra recess. Sometimes it was a few minutes on a tablet. Sometimes it was a certain toy. So a reinforcer literally can be anything, and it's going to vary depending on the child and what their preferences are. But you can reinforce and promote a positive behavior by adding in reinforcers. So there really is a science to this. Behavior theory gets very specific about how that might look and when you would fade the reinforcer, etc. There's a lot to it. So intervention types. If you add something to encourage a behavior, that's a positive reinforcement, as I just mentioned. If you take something away to encourage a behavior, that's a negative reinforcement. So, you know, maybe the child has a really hard time paying attention when they have a fidget spinner. and it just causes tons of problems. And so in order to get better behavior from that child, we take away the fidget spinner for the time being or for circle time or whatever, and they're able to better engage. So by taking away something, we've actually encouraged positive behavior. And so that's called a negative reinforcement, because it's removal of something in order to increase good behavior. And then following a behavior with something unpleasant or painful in order to discourage it is punishment. Again, this looks very different, of course, in a laboratory setting versus a classroom setting. And punishment is not corporal punishment where you're spanking a child, right? It could be removal of privileges or something like that. So punishment is maybe not necessarily the right word that we would use specifically in preschool classrooms, or approach that we would take. But just so that you know, in the context of conditioning, punishment is sometimes employed in order to support behavior improvement. So B.F. Skinner developed the Skinner box, and this is really interesting. You guys will see some additional research about this in your module this week. He used this to conduct his experimental research on operant conditioning theory. And so he would have a small animal. He did it with pigeons, and was actually able to train pigeons to do certain behaviors based on responses. And so in this case, obviously it's a mouse, but there's a lot of different things. And so that little kind of table looking thing that the mouse is at is actually a lever that he can push down. And so as he pushes that lever, then he gets a response. For example, perhaps a food pellet falls out of the dispenser when he pushes the lever. And so he used this in a variety of different ways, and he used it with these terms, right, with positive reinforcement, negative, and punishment when he wanted the animal to do or not do something. And he did, in fact, successfully train pigeons to do some skills. So very interesting research and work, really amazing, sort of, what even these animals are capable of, and kind of reaffirms what we know, right, and what he's taught us, but especially, and that is that children are, and humans, really, children and humans in general, are impressionable to different types of interventions. And so that's kind of important to know and to remember and to think about. And so then Albert Bandura is the last theorist we're going to look at this week. He actually developed what we call the social learning theory. And this is certainly a form of behaviorism, but is more specific to how behaviors are actually learned. So whereas the other theorists sort of looked at how can we change behaviors, how can we influence them, how can we form them for better or for worse, how are they formed, Albert really focused specifically on how do we learn behaviors and why do they happen. So he kind of went into the theory behind why behaviors exist. And so the kind of two main things that he found are many of our behaviors are learned based on what we observe other people doing. And then influences and influencers around us determine and shape our behaviors. And more importantly, from his work, we know that if children have adult models and peer models, so for example, children the same age as them, versus adults, they're actually more likely to imitate the adults. And so that's really important to know and to think about. They are paying attention, they're listening, they're watching, and they are certainly impressionable. And so he found and believed that operant conditioning occurs through engagement with the environment around us. So whereas the other theorists sort of wanted to specifically test operant conditioning or have a certain outcome, Albert Bandura felt that it just happened naturally. What we learn is going to be determined based on how our behaviors are reinforced or not, for example. How do we behave appropriately in a social setting given expectations? So if you've been in a restaurant recently and you're kicking and screaming and throwing a fuss, or you start a fight, you're going to get kicked out, right? You're not going to be welcome there any longer. If you're at some sort of establishment that has a specified dress code and you're not in dress code, then you'll probably be asked to leave, right? And so that's operant conditioning just occurring in natural settings. You're going to learn what to do and what not to do based on the environment around you and the people around you. Obviously, Albert Bandura's theory can be closely and easily linked to both Piaget's and Vygotsky's based on what we know about them and talked about last week. So his famous experiment was called the Bobo doll experiment. And this little guy in the photograph behind him is actually from the video of that Bobo doll experiment. So you'll have that in your module this week as well, and you can watch that. The video is a little bit older, but it's very interesting research that Bandura conducted and kind of really interesting findings that we see from that research. And so really what you'll learn from Bandura primarily is that, again, children are impressionable. They learn by seeing. They are going to be influenced by what we say and what we do as adults and teachers and parents. And so we really have to be setting good models and examples for them if we want them to learn appropriate behaviors. To kind of close here and compare, as you've learned and heard, each of the behaviorism theorists contributed different information. So very kind of varying and diverse intents with their work and their research, but all very important information to help our understanding of behaviors. They present a picture of behavior as a whole, so each of them contributed something important to our total understanding, much like many of the other theories we've talked about. Each of them has definitely strengths standalone and on their own, but really we get a complete picture when we look at all of them together and kind of everything they've contributed and what they've taught us. So you'll close out the week with the marshmallow experiment video, hilarious video. There's not closed captioning specifically on this video, but what is said by the children throughout the video is closed captioned automatically. So you should be able to read that and be able to hear them well and understand what's going on in the video. And honestly, most of it's observation anyways. So really you're watching what they do and their responses and their behaviors. So as you watch that, I want you to think about the different theories that we talked about this week and that I've just lectured on for the last few minutes. Think about the difference when there's one child versus two and which theory may come into play in that case. And then you'll end the week with comparing that marshmallow experiment to each of the four theories. So what would each of the theorists say about why those behaviors are happening based on what they know and we have studied and looked at and their contributions. So again, you can do the video as a whole in your reflection, and that might be fine. But if you wanted to focus on a specific child or pair of children, for example, in this case, brother and sister, and look at them through the lens of each of the theorists, that might be easier. So I don't have a preference which way you do it. It's totally up to you. But you will be finishing out the week with that assignment. So enjoy. I think it's a fun way to compare those four behaviorism theories, and very interesting video to kind of watch and see, and then think about what kind of the long-term implications would be as children grow and moving forward. So have a good week. Thanks for your attention, and I'll talk to you guys next week.